Hello again, it's Doug here. This is the fourth and final video in the series on finishing a Brian May Red Special guitar body. The first video was an introduction to the materials and processes. In the second I covered veneering techniques, and in the third one grain filling and staining the veneer. So this brings us to the final process, which is coating the surface with clear lacquer. As before, there are numerous segments in the video which are listed with a time index in the description below, so you can easily navigate between any sections of interest. I discussed the reasons why I chose to use Rustins Plastic Coating in preference to an aerosol-based clear lacquer such as nitrous cellulose in the introductory video. And that's not simply because it's what Brian did on the original guitar. So if you want to know the reasons why I chose Rustins Plastic Coating, go and have a look at the introductory video. But for now, let's move on to talk about the product itself, its advantages and constraints on its use. So Rustins Plastic Coating is a two-part cold cure lacquer based on urea formaldehyde resins. It's plasticized with alkyd and reinforced with melamine. Now this product's been available in the UK for many decades and was of course the finish of choice for Brian May when he built his Red Special guitar back in the early 1960s. It's described by the manufacturer as highly durable, resistant to heat, impact, abrasion and solvents. And you prepare it by mixing 1 part of the hardener to 4 parts of the plastic coating itself by volume, and you can apply it using a brush, a roller or a lamb's wool pad. You can also spray it too, and there are some instructions in the leaflet on how you prepare it for spraying. So there are 2 principal issues if you choose to use Rustins Plastic Coating to lacquer your Red Special replica. The first being it isn't readily evident how many coats you should apply to a veneered guitar body or an unpainted neck. Now, the second is that you can experience difficulties if the correct method of application isn't strictly followed, and that can result in wrinkling or rippling of the finish. So I want to discuss that here because that's very important. Now, previous revisions of the Rustins Plastic Coating instruction leaflet stated a minimum of 3 coats is recommended, but many more can be applied, and marquetry is often given as many as 9 coats. When burnishing to a mirror finish, at least 5 coats are applied. Now, Brian himself has commented that he applied many coats, therefore taking this information together it gives us a reasonable hint to the minimum and maximum number of coats we should be applying. Now, I've seen on internet forums that several users quote some personal experience or advice they received from Rustins technical support, which confirms the fact you either have to apply up to 3 coats within 2 hours to achieve the window for a chemical bond, I'll discuss more about that shortly, or wait several days for each previous coating to fully harden to ensure that you're going to get a satisfactory mechanical bond between each coating. The risk is if additional coatings are applied between these windows, you can risk trapping the solvent in the mixture that's hardening, and that causes the layers below to soften and wrinkle. Now, ambient temperature affects the curing time, so I think it's likely that many people in cooler climates such as the UK experience problems because this was less than the recommended minimum of 15 degrees Celsius, or they had high humidity, or both. Therefore, previous coatings hadn't fully hardened before they applied more. The latest revision of the Rustins Plastic Coating instructions for application mentions these constraints explicitly. So taking these constraints and information into consideration, I decided not to risk applying multiple coatings in a few hours, and instead conservatively chose to apply 1 coat at a time and let it fully harden at a temperature between 20 and 25 degrees Celsius for a minimum of 3 to 4 days. The only issue I experienced during that process were small blemishes resulting from trapped air bubbles in the hardened coating. Now, the obvious disadvantage of this approach is it will take 3 to 4 weeks to fully coat the guitar body and neck based on 3 days hardening time per coating and application of say 7 to 9 coatings. In the shot here I've assembled all the items that you would need to make up a batch of Rustins Plastic Coating and, if necessary, to tint it. So let's just talk about the individual items first. Let's just cover this one quickly. I talked about this in the introductory video. It's a 1 litre carton of Rustins Plastic Coating which has lost its solvent. So you can see that it's gone a darker yellow, it's quite viscous, and the container has got sucked in. So this carton was never opened. I bought the 250ml carton plus hardener, and a pack of 1 litre plastic coating plus hardener for use on my build. So I've had this since 2017 and it's never been opened. So I contacted Rustins Plastic Coating technical advice, and they told me that it's most likely lost its solvent. Now that's not a solvent that you can easily replace. There's no common household solvent such as acetone or isopropyl alcohol in that. So I'm afraid that batch of Rustins now is spoiled, so we'll have to discard that. Let's talk about the smaller pack, the 250ml pack of Rustins Plastic Coating. So you can see that's sealed in plastic, presumably to help the solvent to stay where it's supposed to be in the pack. There's some hardener, and there's an instruction leaflet. Just a reminder, I'm using vinyl disposable gloves. None of the stuff is chemicals you really want to get on your skin. I've got some Rustins specific thinners and brush cleaners. Now you may be able to use some other type of thinner, but it's always best to use what the manufacturers recommend. I'm going to apply the Rustins with this very fine artist brush. Now this is a 1.5 inch brush, which is used for laying down a wash when watercolour painting. So I've taken the Rolls-Royce option, and I've gone for the best possible brush I could find. We'll use that to apply it. I've got 3 of these screw-top polyethylene terephthalate or polyester clear sample containers, which I bought in a pack of 12 cheaply from Amazon. So I've shown you this in another video. I've got some little pots of spirit powder dye, that's mahogany, and this one's black. I'm going to make up batches of 100ml and 2 of 50ml of Rustins using these graduated pipettes. These are 25ml graduated pipettes, and that's a pipette filler. If you took chemistry at school or university, you'll be well familiar with those. And I've also got a small set of weighing scales here, which will read to 0.1 gram accuracy and has a tare function. So what we'll do there is put the pot onto the scales. You need this little tray there, and tare the balance, and then we'll pipette out our 50 and 100ml batches of Rustins Plastic Coating into each of these. During my Red Special build project, I found that a 250ml pack of Rustins Plastic Coating and hardener was sufficient to coat the whole guitar neck and body. So that's what I'll be using in this demonstration. I made up the mixture in screw-top clear plastic containers like this in 100ml portions. Although the instructions recommend using each batch within 2 days, I found that it would remain usable for up to 3 weeks if I kept the container sealed and refrigerated at 4 degrees Celsius. Now, of course, if you choose to apply a large quantity in a single day, the simplest method is to make up the whole 250ml plastic coating with the 63ml of hardener. Now, the pack states that this yields 312ml of mixture, so this must either take into account 1 ml of volume reduction or some residual mixture remaining in the carton, and they haven't got the maths wrong. So for demonstration purposes, I'll make up 100ml batch and 2 50ml batches using these graduated pipettes. I'll use the 100ml batch for applying to these grain-filled and stained test panels, which I prepared in the previous video, and I'll use each 50ml batch to demonstrate how to tint the lacquer with this spirit powder dye. Although the mixture is quoted as 4 parts plastic coating to 1 part hardener by volume, I'll measure it out into the container on the accurate weighing scales I showed you earlier, so you can see the actual masses being added. This represents another way of making up the mixture. If you want to work with smaller batches and you don't like the idea of using graduated pipettes like these, which, to be fair, are not ideal for measuring relatively viscous liquids, I do recommend getting a set of digital scales which read to 0.1 gram precision. They are very useful for weighing out products which are sensitive to the mixing proportions. And I bought these when I was considering using West System epoxy resin. Firstly, I'm going to make the 100 milliliter batch of Rustins Plastic Coating and hardener. For that I need 80 milliliters of the plastic coating itself and 20 milliliters of the hardener. As you can see, these scales have a 60-second auto shut-off feature, which is not terribly helpful because this is going to take me a few minutes to do. So the way I'll manage that is to not use the tare function. We'll just take a note of the mass of the container without its lid, which is 17.9 grams. So then I'll weigh it again at the end so we can determine how much mixture that we've put in. So I need 80 milliliters, so I'm going to pipette out 3 25 milliliter batches and then one 5 milliliter batch. Okay, so that's the plastic coating itself put in. I'll now add the hardener. So let's just weigh that batch of the plastic coating itself before we put in the hardener. Remember that the empty container weighed 17.9 grams. So in total we've got 86.6 grams. Now let's add the 20 milliliters of hardener to make up this batch of 100 milliliters of mixture. Again, you're going to use a graduated pipette. This is another clean 25 milliliter graduated pipette. Clearly the hardener is much less viscous. So I'll take it up beyond the mark and let it come back before I add it to the pot. Almost there. It's down to the 5 milliliter mark, so that should give me 20 milliliters of hardener. You see that runs in much more freely. I'll put the lid on, and that's our batch of 100 milliliters of Rustins Plastic Coating mixture. I'll give that a swirl before I apply it, but that's ready to use now. One final thing to do though, let's take the lid off again and let's measure the mass of the empty container, the Rustins Plastic Coating and the hardener we've added. I'll let you do the math as to how much liquid we've added. Okay, so the total is just over 103.1 grams. The empty container was 17.9 grams. There we have the 3 batches of Rustins Plastic Coating, a 100 milliliter batch and 2 50 milliliter batches. Alright, let's move on to applying the 100 milliliter batch to these panels and strips of veneer. Okay, then let's apply the Rustins Plastic Coating to the veneer. The technique is very simple, just load the brush well and apply it quickly and evenly. The instructions say there's no requirement to overbrush because the coating flows out, leaving an even film. Initial drying does begin quickly and you'll find that it will pull on the brush within a few minutes. Now I applied 10 coats to the guitar body before scraping and abrading all the surfaces smooth. However, for this demonstration I'm only going to apply 5 coats to the panels and the strips over the space of 2 weeks before abrading, cutting back and polishing. In this part of the video, I'm going to add two types of spirit powder dye to these two 50ml aliquots of Rustins Plastic Coating, and I'm going to apply them to this spare plywood panel using these foam applicator pads. Okay, first then I'm going to add the black spirit powder dye to one of these batches of Rustins, and this is to demonstrate to you what Brian did to coat the fretboard of his red special. Now, ordinarily you don't need very much of this, it's very intense dye, but in this case I want to make absolutely sure that we have an opaque mixture. So I'm going to apply it quite generously to the Rustins. Let's see if that random amount I added actually gives us an opaque mixture. Okay, let's continue stirring. That's coal black now, absolutely intense. So this is what I referred to in a previous video as black Rustins, which is just Rustins plastic coating with a spirit powder dye added. Okay, let's go for this then and show you how we can coat this plywood panel. Okay, that's going on quite nicely. So in a previous video I illustrated two other methods of using a black lacquer coating on the fretboard. One of them was black super glue, and that dries with a nice hard resin-like finish. And the other was using Liberon spirit dye. There you go. I think that illustrates that process quite nicely. So again, you'd apply that 4 or 5 coats and flat it back. And that's just Rustins Plastic Coating tinted with black spirit powder dye. So having shown you the effect of adding black spirit powder dye to a batch of Rustins, I'm now going to show the options you've got for tinting Rustins with a different colour. Now I have mahogany spirit powder dye, and I've only got red mahogany wood dye. So one option for you if you didn't want to use a grain filler, but yet you still want to have some brownness in your stain, is to actually add brown mahogany wood dye or a brown spirit powder dye to a batch of Rustins. So I'm not going to show you the spirit powder dye, I've illustrated that with the black, so let's put that to one side. I just want to show you that you can dye a batch of Rustins plastic coating with the wood dye, and then I'll apply that to the board. So we'll give that a shake. I'm not going to be very precise with this, it's just to show you the process. Again, you may wish to contact Rustins technical support if you want more detailed information of how much to add. So this is a 50ml batch of Rustins plastic coating. You can see it's a very light straw yellow, almost colourless. Here we go. And again, in this case, just to save me having to wash the brush again, I'll just apply it with a sponge applicator. So this is another method of tinting Rustins plastic coating. And this is one advantage of using the Rustins products, if you can source them in your country, that they do actually blend well together. There you go. You do need to add the red dye directly to the mahogany. If you don't do that, you won't get the right look and you won't get this chatoyancy effect if you only tint the lacquer itself. Quite a few commercial builders do this, and it just simply saves a process, therefore it saves time and it saves money. But I don't believe this is the way that Brian did it. And just to warn you, if you only tint the lacquer and you don't actually apply red stain to the wood, you won't get the same appearance. Okay then, let's apply some Rustins tinted with the wood dye. See, that's quite weak. It's a completely different situation with the black, where to be fair I did add quite a lot of it because I wanted an opaque finish in that case. So that's just to compare and contrast the different options that you've got available. And I'm presenting this as an option to avoid grain filler but to still get a brown colour. So in this case, just to repeat, I've added red mahogany wood dye because that's all I've got. but you could use various different colours. In fact, the spirit powder dyes and the Rustins wood dye come in various different colours. Of course, I'm just assuming that you're going to want to make a red special. You might want to make a red special in blue or green or some other funky colour, and that's completely good. There you go. At this stage, I've applied 5 coats of Rustins Plastic Coating to all the panels on this blockboard. So this is what's left of the aliquot I made up. I've been keeping this in the fridge, so we can do another 3 or 4 coats with that. Let's just take a look now at the finish. So I'll just hold it up to the light and you can see what that looks like. So my original plan for this video was just to apply 5 coats and then start flattening it back. But I'm going to carry on and apply several more. And in fact, on this panel as well, you can see that the veneer surface just there has developed some kind of flaw. So I can feel that with my finger. There's a small indentation. So we'll see how that pans out when I come to flat it back. So the strips have an even more noticeable orange peel finish to them. So this could definitely take several more coats before I start flattening back. You can also see the different colours of the 2 panels. The left hand one is more orangey and the right hand one is more brown. And hopefully you can also see how the hue changes as the incident light angle changes too. See how close I can get. So that's 5 coats of Rustins Plastic Coating. For the final section of this video, I'll discuss and demonstrate sanding back the hardened lacquer and polishing it to a gloss finish. To keep the production time for this video sensible, I only applied 1 additional coating since the previous clip, making 6 in total. In reality, if this was a guitar, I would have applied several more coats before flatting back, probably between 7 and 9 coats. Rustins' own application instructions advise to use a medium fine grade, that is 400 to 600 grit, wet and dry abrasive paper for flatting back between finishes. Here I'll be using this 3M Stick It Gold 600 grit abrasive paper. Now this is high quality abrasive paper which is resistant to clogging and has the advantage of having a low tack self-adhesive backing. And I've cut some off and applied it to this aluminium block. However, it is expensive, and also I couldn't find a supplier of this product in the UK. So I bought a quantity of 120, 320 and 600 grit rolls from Stuart McDonald in the USA, along with an order for some tools to get better value for money from the shipping cost. Now, please bear in mind this section of the video is certainly not intended to be a masterclass tutorial on how to cut back and polish a lacquered surface to a mirror shine. It's just, as with all my videos, a basic demonstration of the consumables and the techniques required in this type of graded approach, which is used on lacquered furniture and obviously automotive paintwork, for example. So if you're seeking expert advice, as always, I recommend that you look elsewhere. There's bound to be hundreds of good quality instructional videos on YouTube on how to apply, cut back and polish lacquer. After recoating with Rustins Plastic Coating, I moved on to a fine grade, that's 1200 grit abrasive paper, and then through to a 1500 grit, and finally a 2000 grit abrasive paper. What I would next do is use this 3M Fast Cut Plus, and that's a very mildly abrasive cutting polish. And finally, I would polish with a very light cutting polish, T-cut in this case. And finally, buff to an ultra deep shine with a good quality automotive resin polish such as this. Now, care must be taken to avoid sanding through the lacquer to the veneer below. So one of the ways I tried to avoid this was by using a Plasterer's Hawk. Now this is a cheap one, it's made of plastic, but it does give you the advantage of having a large and very flat surface which will be used for plastering. So what I did was attach the wet and dry abrasive paper to the underside of this plasterer's hawk, or plasterer's float, using double-sided self-adhesive tape. My theory was that the upper surface of the guitar in particular has quite a complicated shape with several cavities and some quite thin veneer parts, so that makes it quite easy to over-abrade in some areas, but the plasterer's hawk would help me abrade the entire upper and lower surfaces of the guitar body evenly. So I do recommend using some sort of sanding block to ensure that you exert even pressure over the surface, and you only really need to apply light pressure. Let's give this a try. I'm going to flat back these panels with some 600 grit abrasive paper. So I'll go with the left-hand panel first. Okay, so that's the left-hand panel sanded down with 600 grit. Let's examine the surface. Just hold that up to catch the light. You can see there's still some very minor flaws in there, but that's to be expected. At this point, that will be ready for some additional coatings. I'm quite happy with that. Okay, let's move on to the right-hand panel. Repeat the process. So this right-hand panel is proving a little bit more challenging because of this raised spot, which I discussed in an earlier video. I'm going to try moving to just hand sanding. I'm still being very careful, not using a sanding block, but let's give it a try. Very, very light pressure now. So I can also feel on both panels that even though the veneer has actually applied to the blockboard evenly, it feels like the surface of the blockboard, that upper plywood sheet, hasn't laid down evenly or isn't even. Let's continue with some manual sanding. It's probably worthwhile doing so we can compare and contrast. As you can see, applying 6 coats so far at least has given me plenty of lacquer to work with, and there doesn't seem to be any sanding through. We've achieved a similar result. There's a few more of these minor indentations. And again, if this were the actual guitar, I'd move on and apply several more coats of Rustins and then repeat the process of flatting back. And finally, let's sand back these 2 veneer strips. Okay, that's all the panels flatted back with 3M Stick It Gold 600 grit. So let's just have a quick fly around and have a look at the surface. Okay, so this is obviously suitable for re-lacquering now. And I'm going to continue and flat back with some 1200 grit and then just give a few of the panels a polish to show you what kind of shine you can achieve. let's take a look at these panels after abrading with the 1200 grit abrasive paper. And we've got a slightly better finish now. There is a tiny little bit of veneer sand through on these strips. You see that there. So I'm actually quite pleased that's happened, as it gives me a chance to show you what it looks like. But I've been lucky, I wasn't particularly careful braiding back these strips. Just trying to get on with it for this video. And that's all that's really happened on this whole series of test panels, is that little bit of sand through there. Anyway, let's move on now and polish it up. Right, so in the first stage of the polishing, I'm going to use this very light cutting polish, 3M Fast Cut Plus. I'm going to apply that with a soft, damp cloth. I'm only going to polish one of these panels just for brevity. Okay, let's have a reasonably generous amount on there and apply it. Perhaps you can hear that as I'm applying it. There's an extremely light abrasive action. Don't let the cloth dry out. You need to apply a reasonable amount of force into this just to generate a little bit of frictional heating. That helps polish it. And already I can see a slight sheen forming on the surface. Now, Rustins themselves sell a burnishing cream, and this is what would have been available to Brian back in the 1960s. So as I've been saying throughout these series of videos, modern adhesive technology and other types of chemical formulations have advanced a lot since the 1960s. So this kind of stuff, I suspect, would be very similar to the burnishing cream that Brian used, the Rustins burnishing cream. Okay. I hope you can see even just with this, there's a nice gloss finish coming onto the coating. Now, of course, I haven't fully flatted this back, applied more coatings, so there are a series of indentations into the surface. I'll just hold that up to the camera. So already you can see that there's no reflection on the right-hand panel for comparison. Really, that's now reflective, and you can see all the indentations in the surface. So let's carry on and see if we can get a nice gloss finish on this. Wet the cloth again. Apply a bit more of a Fast Cut Plus. Keep going, repeat. It's quite a time-consuming process, but try to enjoy this, get some music on in the background. Do it manually. I would also resist the temptation to use an automotive polisher, an electric polisher on this. I always prefer to do things manually. It gives you more control. The temptation with any kind of automated process is to overdo it. Before you know it, you've taken off a layer of Rustins, or you've concentrated too much into one place, and you'll have undone a lot of good work. So just take your time with this. Okay, cloth's dried out now. Just another cloth to wipe it off. You can see that that shine's coming along quite nicely. So I can buff this to a mirror finish, but of course it's not an even finish because I haven't applied enough coats and flatted it back. Okay, let's hold it up to the light. You can see it's reflecting quite nicely now. Let's keep going once more. Wet cloth. Apply some Fast Cut Plus to the cloth. There we go, that'll do. Another round of polishing. You can take this process as far as you want. If you want a really deep mirror finish, you keep going down to different grades or higher grades of abrasive paper, 2000, even 3000. I don't have the time to do this for this video, it's just to illustrate the techniques. Back to the microfiber cloth, take that off. Okay, let's move up to the T-cut metallic polish. Okay, in the final process then, I'm going to do some polishing with this T-cut automotive polish for metallic finishes. Use the same cloth. I'm going to also use this damp, just to try to avoid putting too much friction or heat into the surface. And this is a liquid now, there's no abrasive action in this metallic finish polish. Any cutting is coming from the formulation of chemicals in the polish. Whereas I think with the Fast Cut Plus, that's got some very small micro abrasive particles in it. That's the difference between these two products. So the Fast Cut Plus is really used for taking swirl marks out of paintwork or plastic. It's very good if you've got plastic windows on a boat or a caravan. You can use that to remove the swirl marks and then polish it up with a polish. So I shouldn't expect to have any swirl marks at this stage. So this will be the final process. At the end of this, I'll just hold it up to the camera and I'll show you what you can do. All right, almost there. Putting quite a bit of pressure on this now to try and get a good shine. Okay, and we'll just wipe it off and show you what we've got. It's a great reflection on the surface there. Compare and contrast, that's just a few minutes work from a 1200 grit finish through to a mirror shine. My final remarks on this process are to stress that I didn't try to obsessively cut back and polish to a flat mirror finish for two reasons. Firstly, to try to minimise my exposure to the frustrating consequences of removing too much lacquer, but also because I was trying to achieve a sensible compromise between a handmade guitar that resembles a new version of Brian's original and a pristine factory finish with an unnatural manufactured appearance. In conclusion then to this series of videos on finishing a Brian May Red Special replica guitar, I'm going to say that I'm satisfied that the result I achieved using these processes that I've illustrated gives you an authentic representation of Brian May's original Red Special. But I'm not claiming that my methods represent exactly how Brian did it, because that's not known. My Red Special replica, which you can see in the shot here, exhibits that same colour variation from reds through orangey browns to a kind of chestnut brown, depending on the colour temperature and the angle of the incident light. It has a dark grain, and the surface of the mahogany exhibits this chatoyancy or tiger's eye phenomenon. I'm not trying to dictate to you how you should finish a Red Special replica, because I don't claim to be an authority on the Red Special, I've just built one. And there are several ways to achieve these characteristics, including avoiding grain filler and just tinting the lacquer, as I've shown you. However, I am certain that if you don't apply wood dye to the mahogany itself, the surface of your guitar won't exhibit this same kind of colour variation or the extent of colour variation that Brian's original guitar does. And this is because the various chromophores are not directly on the kind of crystalline-like facets of the wood grain, so necessarily they won't reflect the light in different ways. Now, I've found that many commercial replicas, both budget and high-end, are finished by tinting the lacquer, because this only involves one process and is therefore cheaper and quicker. So I'll say, if achieving a cosmetic appearance that is very authentic to the original instrument, that's important to you, I recommend do apply the wood stain directly to the mahogany, be it solid mahogany or veneer. As always, thank you very much for watching. The support and interest of Brian May guitar and gear enthusiasts is very much appreciated, and I'll just finish with showing you the upper and lower faces of my guitar.